All right, we're all set. So if you remember where we left off on last Wednesday, we left off finishing up the Neo-Freudians, which the last one that we worked on was Karen Horney. And as I mentioned, um, her focus was very much on not necessarily, the sexual aspects of life, but more of the culture and gender issues dealing with personality and personality outcomes. And she believed, or she theorized that in early childhood, again, our Freudians are going to very much focus on early childhood, is that we have three tendency, and that's to either move towards people or move against people or move away. And that really sets up our socialization as we move through our lifespan. Um, the next theory that we want to kind of take on is the behavioral perspective. If you remember back in our learning section, behaviorism is this idea that basically we're all born with blank slates. I use the modern version of blank hard drives, and it's what experience writes upon, and that everything about us, our language, our emotions, our personality, are all learned traits. And so probably the most famous behaviorist who argued for this idea was B.F. Skinner. If you remember, he is our operant conditioning person, with reward and punishment as a primary motivation to either continue a behavior or decrease that behavior over time. Okay. And what Skinner believed is that we learn to behave in a particular way based upon our reinforcement and consequences of the environment. Um, and he's also going to be one of the first to argue that personality actually develops across the entire lifespan, that we come across different reinforcements and consequences based on the environment that we're in, and that shapes our personality. And the variability in personality between one individual and another individual is we all experience even the same environment differently from each other. And so the reinforcement and the consequences adjust based on our experience with a given environment. Okay. Now, we'll see here in a little while that we're probably not completely born with a blank slate, and that there are personality traits that are partially inherited, and there's one that is mostly inherited from our genetics. But the one thing that we can take away from the behavioral perspective is that life experience, especially in a given environment, is important, and it can shape our personality factors over time. Um, and so this theory really brings into focus the importance of the environment and how that environment molds us to be adaptive to it throughout the lifespan. So that's the behaviorist approach to understanding how personality is. Um, but let's take on, if you remember, we talked about Albert Bandura and his social cognitive theory. We mostly focused on the idea of observational learning, which I said is kind of unique to humans, and close relatives to humans, and that we learn and observe someone's behavior and its consequences. Okay. And so what Bandura's social cognitive theory actually emphasizes is that both learning but also thought processes, our individual interpretation of a given situation, is the source of our individual differences in personality. Okay. Um, and he believed that the important components to going into the development of our personality is something we call reciprocal determinism. And I'm going to change the slide to kind of graphically show what's meant by this. Is what Bandura argued is that just like the behaviorists, that our behavior and situational factors are taken into place, but what Bandura is adding to is the cognitive factors. And you can see the arrows, there's not a one-way arrow on this. Situational factors influence cognitive factors as much as cognitive factors influence situational factors. And same with behavior. But what he argued is that in any given situation, we have a cognition about it. We have an interpretation. We can look at, if we go back to Piaget's theory, when he talked about schemas, we have a basic idea of any given situation, whether it's walking into a classroom or walking into work. We're already setting up what we should expect for that situation to navigate it. And then we have behavioral expectations based on that schema as well. And then it's the interaction between these things, whether we have a favorable outcome or an unfavorable outcome, that then we adjust our thought process. Okay. And so when thinking about the self and one's personality, it is the interaction between what we think about, our cognitive structure, that schema we have about a situation or an emotion or a thought even, and then the behavioral and situational factors that play into that then adjust it over time. Okay. But when it does come to Bandura, probably one of his biggest contributions to our understanding of personality and personality factors is his definition or coming up with self-efficacy. Okay. So we have self-esteem, which is the positive or negative evaluation of oneself. Okay. But then we also have a separate term called self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is your belief in being able to accomplish something. All right. So it's your belief in being able to complete successfully Introduction to Psychology in the next 2 weeks. It's your belief that you can be a successful parent or a successful whatever your occupation is. And sometimes it even comes down to simplest things like your belief that you can fix a dinner or fix lunch and those kind of things. The reason why this is different than self-esteem is a person could have low self-esteem. They can have an overall global evaluation of themselves as maybe not worthy or more worthless or those types of things, but they still can have self-efficacy in, despite my view of myself, I still can do these things. I can still work. I can still go to school. And likewise, people with high self-esteem may also have low self-efficacy. So they might really think very well of themselves, but not that confident in their abilities. And that's why these are two separate variables. And we know that since the development of Bandura's self-efficacy theory, we know that this is a determinant on people's success, on people's ability to work and be successful in life, less so than even self-esteem. I mean, more so than even self-esteem, excuse me. And so this has become a big variable, and I would encourage you to look in areas where you feel you have low self-efficacy and really evaluate those areas of your life and try and determine how you can gain efficacy in those areas of your life that are important to you, but you feel that you're not at that level of security or confidence in developing those. So, all right. So another addition, Julian Rotter came up with another important component. So we've talked about a few so far. We've talked about extroversion, introversion, self-efficacy, and this is another type of personality factor that we have to take in control when we're trying to understand our ability to navigate the world. And this is our locus of control, okay? The broad definition of locus of control is just the belief about the power we have over our lives, okay? And this is proposed as a cognitive factor that then affects our learning and our personality development. And to kind of exemplify this, there's really two types of locus of control: internal and external. Internal locus of control is the tend to believe that outcomes are directly result of one's own effort. Okay. And we know that people with a strong internal locus of control tend to perform better academically, achieve more in their careers, more in depth and healthier and less depressed, because they feel that their accomplishments is because of their own drive and their own ability. Now, this is versus what's called external locus of control, and this is a tendency to believe that outcomes are due to outside of the self. It's society or culture or people in your life that are controlling your ability. So it's a belief life is controlled by others. It's also controlled by luck or just chance. Okay. So if we look at this graph, internal, I'm in control of the outcome, belief in one's effort and decisions to determine outcomes. And then external is outcomes are beyond my control, belief that luck, fate, or other people determine an outcome. Okay. Now, when we look at this from, you'll notice that locus of control is in the middle, because there's some aspects of our life where we have stronger internal locus of control. And then there's probably other parts of our lives where we have a strong external locus of control. So, if we want to think about this on more of a global level, is individuals who are in poverty, for example, may have a strong internal locus of control when it comes to parenting and very within their circle of control, but they may feel like that, for example, their financial situation, their work situation, their living situation is not within their control, because they always tend to be stuck in this economic environment. Okay. And again, where should we head with this is, one, we stronger internal locus of control does promote better academics and career, but then on the other side, we do have to realize that there are aspects of life that we don't necessarily control, and keeping those things into balance is important. I won't spend too much time on this one because we've already went over the Mitchell's marshmallow studies when we went through the development section. The thing that I will just say is when it comes to, when we say the person situation debate, is remember when we go back to the Mitchell studies, it was the marshmallow studies where kids either had that self-control to wait for the second marshmallow, or they needed that instant gratification and ate that marshmallow first one without waiting for the experimenter to come back. And a lot argued with the Mitchell study. Well, it's because the children with more self-control had an innate ability to withhold gratification, that it was something about those children that made them stronger than other children when it comes to self-control. Okay. But remember, when we talked about this in the development section, there was a reanalysis of this done recently. I believe it was in 2013, 2014, because Mitchell, he left out some of the variables that he measured. One of them was social economic status. And what he found is that children in the high social economic status tended to be able to have more self-control, where children in the low social economic status tended to have the quote unquote poor self-control. But if we analyze the difference between these children, remember what I said about children, especially in the very lower end of the social economic status, they sometimes don't know when their next meal is going to be there. They don't always know the situations that are going to be taken away from them. And so when you set something in front of that child, because they know there's no guarantees in life, they will consume that item then and not wait in control. Whereas children who are in the higher social economic status know their next meal is going to come and have that more consistent, predictable environment to where they know they could wait and gain that second marshmallow. Okay. And this is the person to situation debate that we talk about, because it's not so true that these children with self-control, that's an innate quality about them. It's probably going back to Bandura's idea of the situation, behavior, and cognition, and the need to satisfy some need, such as hunger, as an example. And so yes, so is there a lot, do kids who have that self-control have better outcomes? Yes, but those better outcomes are also associated with their social economic status. Do we find children who are in the low income areas that go, for example, through Head Start and they focus on self-control and all those things? Do they tend to do better? The answer is yes. And so these things can be quote unquote taught, they can be provided. But again, it has to do with that consistent environment that the children need to be in. All right, so the criticisms that we need to note about, for example, behaviorism and even the social cognitive theories and Freud's theories, is that they're all deterministic. All those theories, the behaviorist approach, why you're behaving the way you are today isn't because of your choice. It's because of a reinforcement history that has led you to where you are right now in this moment. It really wasn't your choice. This is just this is where you are based on your learned, reinforced history. When we talk about Freudian theory, your behaviors are predetermined by your unconscious experiences, your early childhood development. And it's not really you making the choices, it's this negotiation with the unconscious world, okay? And I brought this up at the beginning of the semester. This was then a lot of psychologists became very dissatisfied with it and said, there should be some will in life. And this came up with what in the 1950s, what was called the humanistic approach, okay? At the time in our country in the 1950s, we went through 2 world wars. We're still fighting abroad. We're still engaged in a lot of turmoil in the world after the aftermath of World War II, and now we have the advent of the communist movement, and we have the nuclear age and Cold War starting, and people were kind of losing hope in this world that was being created. And so at the time, there was a theory that, or a philosophy, I should say, that people really connected with, and it was called existentialism, okay? And the basis of existentialism is the world, there is no order to the world. The world is a chaotic place. There's no meaning to it. And it's just that way. There's no meaning to life. All right. And then humans, and this is where we get the humanistic idea or humanistic theory. Humans, in order to bring meaning to life, create governments, we create schools, we create religions, we create all of these things to bring meaning to life. All right. Now, the reason why this theory is important is not necessarily, if you want to do the chaos part or whatnot, is that means that humans have free will. Okay, without the world without the world being meaningless, in a sense, according to existentialism, then how could we be free? How could things would still be determined if things were not meaningless to begin with? And this is the idea behind the whole idea of free will from a philosophical perspective. And so humans have free will. And this is an important part of humanistic theory because it also means that we must be motivated towards something. Okay. And again, the first person to theorize about this was Abraham Maslow. And if you remember, he's our pyramid guy. And I won't get too much into this because we went over it at the beginning of the semester, but he's our pyramid guide where, at the base, we have our physiological needs, our safety needs, our social needs, and then our individual needs. And if we have all of those in a line, we can become this, what he called self-actualized person. All right. And he studied people who he thought was self-actualized, Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. And he found that all of these individuals had some shared characteristics. One, they tended to be open to experience, creative, loving, spontaneous, compassion, concern for others, and accepting of themselves. And we're going to see this, these characteristics well measured in trait theory, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay. But probably our better definition for self-actualization came from Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers believed that each individual really has the answers to their problems. They just need someone who is there unconditionally to help them understand or get clarity on their ideas. Okay. And he's also someone who linked personality with self-concept. Remember, self-concept is that everything that you can say is you, your thoughts, your feelings about ourselves. Okay. And as mentioned again at the beginning of the semester, the self and the real self, the self is divided into two components. We have this ideal self. This is a person we should be or we would want to be. So this is the best mom, the A 4.0 student, the most most productive at work, song artist, movie star, all of those things that we think we should be or would like to be. And then we have the real self, which is the person that is actually here in this moment that is existing. And it's all your good qualities and your bad qualities, and it's just who you are, okay? And what Rogers theorized is that a healthy individual or the ideal self is when the ideal self and the real self are congruent with each other, okay? Meaning that we don't necessarily become the rock star, but we tend to look at all our positive and negative qualities, and we make our ideal and real self one in the same. Okay. And when what we find is that when the ideal self and the real self are closer together, we tend to be more adaptive, have higher self-worth, health, and productive lives. But what Rogers noticed is that the further and further apart the ideal self and the real self become, the more maladjustments we see. So the more higher levels of depression and anxiety and mental illness and mental health issues, which we'll start talking about on Wednesday. The further that real and ideal self are from each other, the more maladaptive and maladjusted we become. So from the humanistic perspective, our goal is to realize who we are as a complete self, complete person, and have our ideal self and real self almost be one and the same. Okay. All right, so I do want to hit on the biological approach, and what the biological approach wants to understand is how much of our personality is due to inherited or genetic predispositions, and what physiological processes are involved in these. And I have to just kind of do this warning up front. The original heritability traits for personality come from the Minnesota twin studies. This is where identical twins are separated at birth to different families. And then it is assumed that the similar personality traits can't be due to environment, they have to be due to heritability, okay? And in the original one, there was about a 0.50, the scale from 0 to 1, or you could think of it as a percentage of 50% heritability ratio. But there has been a lot of challenges to this idea, because when we look at things like leadership and obedience to authority and sense of well-being and alienation and resistance to stress and fearfulness, these can all be explained due to the situation, regardless of being raised in two different environments. And I think the example I gave earlier in the semester is, for example, even when a teacher says that they treat their students fairly, they don't provide any less or more attention to one or another child, those kinds of things. When we actually go measure that, we actually find even the most sworn unbiased teacher will provide the more attractive children with more positive feedback, more teacher time, and when it comes to disciplinary things, they do more proactive type of discipline instead of reactive discipline. And then with the less attractive children, they tend to give more negative feedback, more punitive consequences, and less attention. So if you have two identical twins, and even though they're raised in even separate schools, they're more likely being treated the same based on their physical attributes, okay? And this is where it gets difficult determining the heritability traits based on twin studies. And if you read the literature on this, the heritability is anywhere from 0.2 up to 0.7, really dependent upon the study you read. And so this is an area that we're still trying to determine. This is one of those I mentioned when we started talking about personality. This is one of those areas that we're really still struggling with, is trying to determine the genetic determinism of different personality traits. But there is one biological determinant that is probably close to 100% biological base, and that's an individual's temperament, okay? We find that we can categorize very young at an age babies into three categories: an easy baby, difficult, meaning a child who is very resistant, doesn't like being around, very reactive. And then the slow to warm. This is a child who enters an environment, is very wary in the beginning, and it takes them a while to start interacting with people around them. Okay. And so if you want to think about this, this is a term, if you have a high temperament, you're very reactive emotionally very quickly. If you have a low temperament, you tend to be less reactive and less emotional reactive. Okay. And what we have found is that now this is important to state though, is our temperament tends to be set at birth, but our reaction to our temperament can be determined by the child's interaction with the world and the adult's interaction with the world. Meaning that someone who quote unquote is a hothead can learn to control that temperamental response, just like a person who is very low in temperament can understand that in certain situations they need to be reactive in a given situation, that they can't just kind of let their emotions kind of warm up to the situation. So again, we have an interaction for the behavior, but this tends to be one of those personality factors that tends to be set at birth. All right. So I want to spend the rest of our class, because you guys had an assignment to do the Big Five personality assessment. So I kind of want to go over the theory of trait theory. And basically to just kind of explain what is a trait theory. Trait theory is this idea that there's certain amount of traits that then vary, that then determine your unique way of interacting with the world. Okay. The first person to come up with trait theory was Gordon Allport, and he found that at least in the English language, there's about 4,500 words that could be categorized into three categories. Okay. Cardinal traits are dominant in the entire personality, dominates the entire personality. So these are the things, those few things that tend to be consistent regardless of the situation and age, that is part of who you are. Central traits are those things that make up our personality. Okay, now cardinal traits are much rarer than central traits, because central traits are those things that we feel we have more control over, and so we emphasize a lot more. And then second traits are less obvious or consistent. So if we think about central and cardinals, they tend to be consistent over time and place, but they can become present under certain circumstances. So, our attitude or our preference in a given situation may adjust the way we express our personality. And then Raymond Cattell narrowed it from 4,500 words, and he narrowed it to 171 traits. And he then identified 16 dimensions of personality. So the point being is you'll notice as we go through these trait theories, we're narrowing down the more consistent traits that we see. And then if you remember, Carl Jung talked about extroversion versus introversion, and we're going to see the Eisnet couple kind of emphasize this a little bit more and give it more definition. So high extroversion is sociable, outgoing. High introversion is high need to be alone, engage in solitary behaviors. And so this is going to become one of the more consistent things that we measure based on personality. The second one is what they call neuroticism versus stability. So someone who is highly neurotic tends to be very anxious, overreactive. They have a very sensitive sympathetic nervous system. And then high instability is someone who has more emotional stability. Okay. And they go through and they measure these things, and they felt that they're so consistent, and they're so consistent over time, that this really might be something that's genetically inheritable. But again, we can look at the arguments for or against. But these are going to be two personality factors that tend to be consistently measured over time and place. And based on these two personality factors, you can see the reemergence of the Greek colicky, sanguine, phlegmatic, and melancholic. But they're going to base it on these two very stable personality factors: neurotic versus stable, extroversion versus introversion. So we're starting to see more of a narrowing of these factors to give us these different personality outcomes. And then eventually what's going to happen, if you'll notice, we have neuroticism right here, and we have extroversion, kind of introversion right here. We found over time that there's three other personality factors that tend to be measured consistently over time and consistently over situations. Okay, I mentioned to you all earlier when we started this lecture, I believe it was when we were talking about Jung. 13 years ago, I measured extremely on the introverted side of the introversion extroversion continuum, and then over time that score has become less extreme, but it still leans towards the introversion side of the continuum. So very rarely will you see someone go from introversion to then extremely extroverted. Once you're kind of on one side of the scale, you'll tend to vary, but you'll kind of stay within that realm of either introversion or extroversion on that continuum. Okay. So this has been shown to be measured very consistently over time. But the other three personality factors that we have found to be consistent is one is called openness to experience. So on one side, you can say this is closed over here, the score low. This is high openness on the right-hand side. So someone who is closed or less open tend to be those who are very practical, believe in convention, and prefer a fixed routine. Okay, if you want to think about this, if we look at it occupational wise, someone who is low in openness would be great for things like building things like construction, assembly line work, those types of things that are based on a routine. Okay. On the high level of openness is this. They have a wide range of interests. They tend to be more independent. They're more likely to read different opinions on a different situation. They tend to be more imaginative and those kinds of things. So this would be occupation-wise, someone who wants to do something creative. Something where scientists are really open and experienced because they're willing to explore outside their known bubble or convention, would say, and those kinds of things. Conscientiousness is the second of the three factors that have been shown to measure consistently. The way that I like to think about consciousness is let's say you're going to go on a vacation, okay? And before you go on that vacation, you make sure all your files at work are in order. All of the information anyone would need, if they need anything from you at work, has it. When you think about your house, you make sure your house is completely clean, everything is in order. So if something happens, someone, can go and make sure the house is okay and whatnot. This is someone who we would consider highly conscientious. They tend to be hardworking, dependable, and organized. However, if you're one of those individuals who, you're going on vacation and you don't really care what your desk at work looks like, and you leave your house and not worry about how clean it is or what people would think if they were to come in while you were gone, this tends to be more people who score lower on the conscientious scale. So it tends to be people who are more impulsive, careless, and disorganized. Okay. And then the third variable that we have found to be consistent is agreeableness. Agreeableness is being cooperative, trustworthy, good-natured. And we find that people who are low on agreeableness tend to be critical, uncooperative, and very suspicious of others. Okay, they're the ones that again, they tend to be the ones who also measure low in openness, because they see things from their perspective, and others people's perspective they can't take into consideration. People who are high in agreeableness tend to be more helpful. They tend to be more trusting of others, and they tend to have higher levels of empathy for other people's plights and concerns. So, and again, this is another one that we found to be measured consistently. So now, when we take this scale into consideration, all right, so measure low, let's say 0. Measure high, let's say 10. If we take those into account and then combined all of these in different ways, there is literally millions of types of personalities from the different combinations of just these 5 factors. Okay. And then you take into account things like self-efficacy, self-esteem, temperament, and then we're multi-million different types of personality and different types of individuals that can be created out of the unique combination of these factors. And that is the appeal to trait theory, because not only does it show that there's these very consistent traits that we can measure over time, but they can be combined in so many ways to really give us an understanding of the uniqueness of each individual. Okay, but again, these 5 factors, and we need to keep some others in mind. One that I didn't mention is grit, and we got to keep in mind self-efficacy, self-esteem. All of those play a factor into these 5-factor models or 5 trait models of personality. So it's the combination of all of those things that really create the uniqueness of each individual. And then we also should take into consideration cultural factors. So probably the cultural factors that tend to be measured the most is things like collectivism versus individualism. This tends to be a varied trait across cultures. If we look at, so let's talk about what collectivism is first and how it influences different personality traits. We find that Asian cultures specifically tend to measure more in collectivism, which is the idea that my success and my failures are not only mine, but they're my community's. So when I succeed, my community succeeds. When I'm successful, my community is successful, and vice versa. If something goes wrong in the community, that's a reflection of the individual. as well, or when something goes right in the community, it's a reflection on the individual as well. And then there's individualism. Individualism is something that most Europeans countries tend to measure high in. And this is the belief that my success and failures are all due to my own behaviors. That my community, my family doesn't determine my success or failure. It is me, the individual, that determines my outcomes. Okay. And we do find that across cultures, this does influence some personality traits. So we take the Asian culture, which tends to measure high in collectivism. They tend to measure less in extroversion. When we take Central and Southern American cultures, which tends to be actually in between collectivism and individualism, they tend to measure in that mid-range. They tend to score higher in openness to experience. And so they tend to be more open to different ideas and different ways and understandings. And then our high individualistic countries tend to score higher in neuroticism, meaning that they tend to be more anxious and worried and those types of things. So this is the influence of culture. And I want to see, but we should also recognize that even though the United States does measure high in individualism, there is some state-by-state differences. So we know that the more recent a state enters into the Union, the more individualistic they tend to be, where the countries or the states that entered into the Union at an earlier date tend to be more collective. So we find on the East Coast with the 13 colonies, they tend to have more of a collective perspective. But then when we look at places like Utah and Alaska, who entered later in the United States, they tend to be measure more extremely on the individualistic end. Okay. And so we can see those personality factors really play a role by state. Okay. But we also can see regional differences. So we can see that a lot of the New England states and Texas, we tend to measure very much higher in temperament and uninhibited behavior. Whereas when we look at these more darker states, they tend to be more friendly and conventional. And then when we look at these Western states in cluster 2, they tend to be more relaxed and creative and measure more in those. And again, this is a regional influence. And one explanation for this is what's called selective migration. And this is where people choose to move a place that are compatible with their personality and needs, meaning that we're attracted to individuals who have more of our personality factors and our emotional factors, and we tend to stay away from those places that are less like us. Okay. All right. So let me stop sharing.